afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Duff, the Executive Director of the Supreme Court Historical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our virtual program and platform today for today's program with Jeffrey Rosen, a good friend, and we're going to discuss his latest book, The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. It was only a year and a half ago that we last talked with Jeff about his then latest book, and that was entitled The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. And we're delighted to welcome him back to discuss The Pursuit of Liberty. Jeff has served as the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia for 12 years, and now he is CEO Emeritus. He is a professor of law at George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor at The Atlantic. Jeff is a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, and Yale Law School. He is the author of 9 books, 2 of which I've already mentioned, along with RBG, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, on Life, Love, Liberty, and Law. His essays and commentaries have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, on NPR, in the New Republic, where he was the legal affairs editor, and in the New Yorker, where he has been a staff writer. Jeff also joined us for a lecture on John Marshall in 2016, and we're delighted to welcome him back. First, Jeff, I want to thank you for this book. It's, I think, more than an important contribution to the understanding of our history and the schools of thought that gave birth to how our country is governed, even to this day. But I also found it to be a balm for our present-day political frictions and environment, and I hope others do too. While we're going to stick to the historical portions of your book today and not get into current events, I would just observe that your book is reassuring about the strengths built into our system of government and its distribution of powers and its ability to check abuses of powers in any of the 3 branches. And for that, we're grateful for your educational endeavor with this book. I'll start with by observing there are many important figures during the formation of our country, its Declaration of Independence, and its Constitution. How did you settle on focusing on just these 2 individuals, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, as you developed your book?
Well, the Hamilton-Jefferson debate is the essential one in American history. In particular, their debate over national power versus states' rights, executive power versus judicial power, and liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution, as well as democracy versus rule by elites. Those are the basic antitheses. I call them golden and silver threads woven throughout the tapestry of American history. And I thought it would be illuminating and useful to trace it from the beginning all the way up. Many historians have noted that the Hamilton-Jefferson debate is the essential one. John Quincy Adams, in his essay on the Jubilee of the Constitution, traced their debate between national power and states' rights to the rise of the political parties. Martin Van Buren, in his Political History of the United States, emphasized that it was the debate between democracy and rule by elites. And what prompted me to write this book was reading a passage by the progressive historian Herbert Crowley, who in The Promise of the American Life called on Theodore Roosevelt to deploy Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends, namely the Hamiltonian means of strong federal power to achieve the Jeffersonian ends of curbing the corporations and promoting democracy. And Theodore Roosevelt picked up that phrase and made it the basis for his new nationalism speech. And then Franklin Roosevelt read a book by a guy called Claude Bowers called Hamilton versus Jefferson, the battle between democracy and aristocracy. And he made it the cornerstone of the New Deal, which took some chutzpah since he was expanding federal power greatly, but invoking the libertarian sage of Monticello. But he emphasized the democratic rather than the libertarian Jefferson, and put Jefferson on the nickel and built the Jefferson Memorial. And then finally, Ronald Reagan said that he left the Democratic Party in 1960 because it had abandoned the limited government principles of Jefferson, and he reinvented the Republican Party of the 80s on those principles. So all this is to say, this is hardly a novel thesis. In some ways, it's the oldest of all theses among American historians. But when I looked, I found to my surprise that no one had actually started at the beginning and taken it all the way up. And on the occasion of America's 250, I thought it would be useful to do just that. And that's why I wrote the book.
That's great. And it's a great contribution and very enlightening. And I think you've shed new light on some old themes that we're familiar with. As you were researching and working on your book, did you find anything that surprised you in the backgrounds of either Hamilton or Jefferson?
Yes. First, I learned that Hamilton may have been Jewish. This was a surprise that was very gratifying to my people. But the historian Andrew Porschwanger notes that Hamilton's mother was married to a Dane called Levine, who was perhaps Jewish, and she may have converted to marry him, and that would explain why Hamilton attended a Jewish day school on Nevis and remembered reciting the Ten Commandments in Hebrew. But whether or not he was Jewish, the real surprise that I learned in this book is how protean the ideas of Hamilton and Jefferson are. They're invoked by by political parties of both kinds and by Supreme Court justices of different perspectives at all the crucial inflection marks of American history. And the central figures are always mixing and matching or switching, and Jeffersonians become Hamiltonian and vice versa. Lincoln noted that after and before the Civil War, the two parties had switched positions in their views on national power versus states' rights as the slavery crisis arose. So what was surprising is how malleable their ideas are, but also how essential they are, because it's really, when I think of the golden and silver threads of their ideas, it's the productive tension on both ends of the thread that sustains the American idea, and on the very rare occasions in American history when the threads are pulled too far in one direction or another, that's when the violence begins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did you find that their personalities influenced their viewpoints at all, and if so, how so?
Very much so. Let's begin with Jefferson. So famously cool and removed. John Marshall called him the great Lama of the mountain, looking down at Monticello on the people below. And there seemed to have been some basic insecurity in his childhood. He was very close to his father, devastated when his father, Peter Jefferson, died when he was 14, and copied into his diaries passages from Cicero's great manual on overcoming grief and fear, called the Tusculan Disputations, but had a more ambivalent relationship with his mother. They may have been estranged. He scarcely mentions her after his father's death. And there was something about an insecurity in his childhood that led him constantly to be seeking refuge in the imagined idyls of ancient Saxon democracy. And he is constantly returning to this Saxon myth, the idea that there was a lost paradise when hardy yeoman farmers living on their shires could engage in self-government on a limited scale. And initially he makes that the basis for the revolution, because he says that the King George has trampled on the ancient Saxon rights that the colonists took with them to America. And then he makes it the sort of foundation of his vision of the Democratic Party, always moving west in an empire of liberty, so that these hardy rural farmers can take their ancient English Saxon rights with them across the burgeoning United States. Eventually that kind of runs out for him, and he has to broaden his gaze to the natural rights of all humankind when the king refuses to respect the Saxon rights of the colonists. But it's the yearning for a kind of imagined security in the past that seems deeply rooted in his childhood.
Interesting. And with Hamilton, any similar personality traits that influenced his viewpoints?
Well, we know from the musical how ashamed he was of his upbringing. John Adams calls him, in the phrase Lin-Manuel Miranda quotes, the son of a Scottish whore. He's so embarrassed that he's illegitimate. And that leads him always to be picking fights with people to assert his status and imagining slights, even when they don't exist. He picks fights both with his antagonists, like Jefferson, Madison, his former friend, but he also picks fights with his allies, like John Adams, inexplicably, who he attacks in the election of 1800, and even George Washington, his patron, who leaves him waiting on the stairs briefly, and Washington upbraids Hamilton, and Hamilton resigns on the spot, even though Washington begs him not to. So it's that yearning desire to prove himself, to assert his status, to wreak himself like a sunbeam on the world, as Hamilton put it, that seems to have come from his embarrassment and shame at his very, very challenging upbringing, and leads him perhaps to seek refuge in the party of the aristocracy and the financial elite and the well-to-do, who had always been his patrons. They're the ones who sent him to the United States to study after he writes an essay about a hurricane in St. Croix that's so literary and powerful that, as Lin-Manuel Miranda puts it, in the musical, Hamilton didn't know it, but he'd just written his way out of poverty, a phrase from Chernow's biography. So he's the self-made man, and that's why he's been reinvented by the musical into the rapping champion of the American dream, a pretty ironic turn for the man who was attacked in his time as a closet monarchist and an aspiring aristocrat who wanted to resurrect monarchy in America. But the personality is so great that, unlike Madison, who it's impossible anyone ever writing a musical about, Hamilton is the guy who got the hit musical.
Let's talk about their intellectual influences and the French, Scottish, British philosophers in the Enlightenment, how they may have influenced the two of them. And then also I would like your view or opinion if you think that their choice of influences reinforced prior held beliefs that they had about government, or do you think those influences actually played an active role in forming their beliefs?
That's a great question. Gilbert and Sullivan famously said, "Every girl and every boy that's born into this world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative." And it may be the case that Hamilton and Jefferson came out a little liberal in Jefferson's case and a little conservative in Hamilton's, and they were drawn to the philosophers who reinforced those views. So Jefferson is a romantic who takes the Whig vision of English history. He sides with Lord Coke in his exaltation of parliamentary supremacy over that of the monarchy. He sees all increases in power as threatening liberty, and he's constantly trying to limit the size of government and also reduce it to its smallest sphere. Let them be divided into wards, says Jefferson, because he wants to have self-government at the level of the township or the ward. All this stems from Jefferson's rosy view of human nature. He thinks that humans are infinitely perfectible and through education may be made perfect, and therefore he's much more trusting of the possibility of universal democratic education on a broad scale. So that's Jefferson. Hamilton is a conservative. He has a dark view of human nature. He thinks people are essentially fallen and need government to constrain their greatest passions. For that reason, he supports a national government and thinks that increases in government power may secure liberty, unlike Jefferson, who thinks the opposite. His hero is David Hume, who takes a Tory view of English history, which exalts the king over Parliament. Jefferson calls this honeyed Toryisms of Hume. And that's why he views the English Constitution as the most perfect in the world. And at a famous dinner party says, in response to John Adams, that the British Constitution would be perfect if purged of its corruption. Hamilton replied, purge it of its corruption, it would lose its perfection. That leads Jefferson to say that he's for a monarchy bottomed on corruption. But in fact, Hamilton is using corruption in the sense that David Hume used it, as a way for the king to influence the legislators who would otherwise be immune to his powers. So that is why Hamilton and Jefferson have different views of the relationship between government power and liberty. And my sense is that they both read Hume and they both read Coke, but Jefferson is more drawn to Coke and Hamilton to Hume because of their essentially liberal and conservative outlooks.
Interesting. You refer in the title of your book to Hamilton and Jefferson igniting the lasting battle over power in America. Those battles, as you've mentioned also with us today, have involved tensions between state, local governments and the national government, as well as battles between the three branches of government in the federal government, legislative, executive, and judicial, and even then, as well as battles within each of those branches and their interpretations of the law. Let's discuss some examples of these early battles and those fundamental views that have, as you said, been woven into the fabric of our country throughout its history.
Well, the essential one is the battle over the bank. That's the most important constitutional battle in all of American history, and it goes on to define all of our subsequent battles. And of course, when Hamilton starts as Secretary of the Treasury, he makes the assumption of state debt as well as the creation of the bank the centerpiece of his plan. George Washington is uncertain about whether the bank is constitutional, so he asks Jefferson and Hamilton for memos on the question, and they become the most important constitutional memos in American history. Jefferson says the bank is unconstitutional because there's no enumerated power to charter a bank, and he wants to construe the necessary and proper clause strictly rather than liberally. And because a bank is not absolutely or indispensably or indubitably necessary to achieve enumerated powers like the power to tax, Jefferson says we shouldn't imply a power to charter the bank. Hamilton disagrees. He stays up all night. He writes 14,000 words, and he says that the word necessary should be construed liberally rather than strictly. And because a bank is useful or conducive or appropriate for carrying out enumerated powers like the power to tax, we should indeed imply a power to charter a bank. And then Washington sides with Hamilton rather than Jefferson. And then a few years later, after Hamilton is martyred in the duel, it goes up to the Supreme Court. And what's so important to emphasize here at the Supreme Court Historical Society is that Marshall reveres Hamilton. He views Hamilton as the greatest man in America, saving always George Washington. He views himself as Hamilton's lieutenant and successor and the bearer of his torch after Hamilton dies in the duel. And Marshall has next to him Hamilton's memo to Washington, because he's writing Washington's biography, which Bushrod Washington has commissioned and given Marshall Washington's paper. So he's got the Hamilton memo right there. And that's why that famous sentence in McCulloch, let the end be legitimate, seems like a direct paraphrase from Hamilton's memo, because it is. It was Hamilton who first wrote a version of let the end be legitimate than any powers that are necessary or appropriate for carrying it out are consistent with the Constitution. And that's what Marshall paraphrases in perhaps the most famous sentence in all of Supreme Court history. I hadn't realized before writing the book how directly Marshall viewed himself as carrying on Hamilton's legacy. He also directly paraphrased Hamilton in Marbury. He's directly paraphrasing Federalist 78 on judicial review. And his famous sentence in Cone in California about how in war we are one people and in commerce one people is a paraphrase of Hamilton's invocation of one people in Washington's farewell address, which he ghost wrote. So the intellectual and political lineage between Hamilton and Marshall is definitive. And ever since then, all the great debates in American constitutional history over the constitutionality of the Louisiana Purchase, of the Missouri Compromise, of the post-Reconstruction Acts, of the New Deal, and all the way down to today, have been recapitulations of the strict constructionism of Jefferson and the liberal or fair constructionism of Hamilton.
The Constitution ultimately was a product of compromise, as you've written over many of these battles between and among the branches of government and federal and state governments. Do you think that Hamilton and Jefferson themselves thought that the compromise, that is the Constitution itself, resolved these battles? Or do you think there are tensions between them were irreconcilable? What do you think they felt at the time regarding the Constitution?
The tensions were not irreconcilable. We know that they were cautiously hopeful that the experiment would succeed, but not terribly optimistic. Hamilton left the convention feeling that his views on executive power had not been adequately taken into account, and he dies lamenting the excess of democracy, which he thinks is the great ailment of America. Days before he dies, he says, "I'm not meant for this world because of the excesses of democracy." Jefferson is also not sold on the Constitution when it was ratified. He tells Madison that he thinks it needs a Bill of Rights. And even after he got there, but by the end of his life, he's lamenting the oncoming secession crisis, endorsing nullification, and fearing the onset of civil war. So it's certainly not the case that either was overly rosy-eyed about the possibilities of success, but they were committed to the ongoing project. You asked, did they think that their tensions were irreconcilable? It's so significant to me that when Hamilton dies in the duel, Jefferson places a bust of Hamilton across from his own in the central entrance hall of Monticello. And when he's old, he passes the bust and smiles faintly and says, "Opposed in life as in death." And for Hamilton, and Jefferson, the other is not a hated enemy to be destroyed, but a respected opponent to be engaged with and debated. And that is the spirit of productive tension and debate that we have to get back to today.
Do you think that's evidence of the two of them embracing a notion that they would need to coexist for the country to succeed or survive? Or did they go that far into their thinking about the future and what their battles involved? And how important do you think it was to them for the coexistence? They weren't. It struck me when I read the book that they weren't necessarily winner takes all. And then we'll talk a little bit later about how they actually relied on each other's principles from time to time. But what is your impression, Jeff, of their viewpoint at the time about the future of the country and the tensions between the two?
That's a great question. I mean, we know that they weren't winner take all because Hamilton supported Jefferson over Burr in the election of 1800. I mean, that was the central choice of his career. He was an opponent of Jefferson, but he thought Jefferson was a patriot and who would sustain the Union, which he thought was all important, whereas he thought Burr was a traitor who was trying to lead a secessionist movement in Spanish Louisiana and set himself up as a dictator of Mexico. And Hamilton was right to worry. Subsequent evidence in the archives of the British ambassador that Henry Adams turned up after Hamilton's death showed that Burr had actually offered his services to the British ambassador to lead this secessionist movement. So that fact that Hamilton and Jefferson, despite their mutual distrust, converged in their opposition to Burr, who they viewed as a crypto-Caesar, Hamilton called him. If we have an embryo Caesar, 'tis Burr, is a sign that they were willing to coexist with the other and that they viewed each other as opponents rather than hated enemies. They were not negatively polarized the way we are today, where some on all sides are more interested in destroying their opponents than debating and engaging with them.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I was unaware of and it surprised me, I think many Americans would be surprised too, was to learn that the northern states in New England had threatened to secede from the Union and form their own confederacy in 1804. Tell us a little bit about that portion of our history.
It's a remarkable history. The Hartford Convention, and preceded by the Essex Junto, it was called, a group of high Federalists in New England that included at different times Gouverneur Morris, or Gouverneur, I guess I should call him as it was pronounced in his day. But it's remarkable that Morris, who's the leading advocate of union at the convention, writes the preamble, is the greatest advocate of national government, switches sides once Jefferson gets into office. And Morris and the High Federalists believe that Jefferson is threatening New England shipping interests with his hated embargo. So after Vermont threatens to secede, they then hatch a plot where they're going to ask Aaron Burr to kind of lead them for a secessionist party. Burr kind of entertains the idea. And Morris ends his life after the passage of the Judiciary Act in particular, which he thinks marks the end of property rights and liberty, openly questioning the Union and toying with the idea of secession, although he ultimately stops short of secession. So this is just one powerful example of the fact that neither party is consistent in their devotion to union. On the other side, there's the head-spinning gymnastics of John Calhoun, who starts as John Quincy Adams' nationalist vice president, switches and becomes the states' rights vice president of Andrew Jackson, but then splits with Jackson in endorsing secession itself and denouncing the hated tariff of abominations in 1832. That's too much for Jackson, who gives his famous toast in response to Calhoun: liberty and union, they must be preserved, nobly siding in the end with liberty over secession. It's a really important reminder of how strong the secessionist turn and urge has been throughout American history. It's been former Unionists embrace it when they feel that their own interests are threatened. However, and this is a really important point, the side of union is always the side of the angels. It's the side of Washington, the great defender of union, and of Marshall, the great successor to Hamilton and defender of union, and of Daniel Webster, and of Lincoln. And it's so significant that Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and that famous phrase, of, by, and for the people, originally traces back to John Marshall and his opinion in Conan, California, in War We Are One People, in Commerce One People. That's paraphrased by Daniel Webster in a debate over nullification. And then a New England clergyman, Theodore Parker, kind of tweaks it a little bit. And then Lincoln basically gets it from Parker by way of Webster and Marshall. Isn't that striking that the great Lincoln in defending Union is channeling none other than John Marshall, and another reminder of the extraordinary power and influence of the great chief?
Well, you do a great job in the book of illuminating these threads, as you've indicated at the outset, was your intention, and it's very illuminating, I think, as we look back to see that they did design a system, Hamilton and Jefferson, that could endure or even thrive on the basic tensions between them. Why do you think? I mean, looking back in retrospect, it certainly worked. But Jefferson himself was not necessarily inclined to stick with this Constitution. In fact, as you pointed out in your book, he believed that constitutions should expire every 19 years. Now, that's quite a I mean, we're fond in many of our presentations at the Historical Society of pointing out that we have had only one constitution in the entire history of our country, and in that same time frame, France has had, I think, 16 different constitutions. So Jefferson seemed more inclined toward the French version of a constitution, it seems. Why do you think that's the case, Jeff?
Well, Jefferson believes the will of the majority must always prevail. He's a Democrat to his core. And whenever there's a clash between the will of the current majority and those of the dead hand of the past embodied in the Constitution, he wants a convention or a popular vote to determine the question. He has a very ambivalent relationship toward constitutionalism. On the one hand, he does support a Bill of Rights, which he thinks should be enforced by judges as a defender of liberty, but he's not at all a defender of federal judicial supremacy, and he wants, his departmentalist theory says that all the branches, and indeed the states, as well as the federal government, should all be able to reach their own independent conclusions on constitutional matters. Jefferson wants to repeal Hamilton's great achievement, which is the section of the Judiciary Act that allows for federal court review of state court decisions, which he thinks is tyrannical. And he is also not clear about which majority he thinks should prevail, but it seems to be the local majority, we the people of the states rather than of the United States, which is why he ultimately endorses secession. He would not have been a fan of federal judicial supremacy as the last word, because that was the opposite of what he believed. And for all those reasons, it was too much for Madison, who thought there had to be a final authority. Madison does support the ability of the Supreme Court to have the last word on constitutional issues. Madison, unlike Jefferson, rejects secession. Madison is always carving out a middle position between the views of Hamilton and Jefferson. Sometimes it's so technical that only he can understand it, but it's very moderate and thoughtful and nuanced, which is why I'm not allowed to pick sides in the book. I try to be neutral between the ideas of Hamilton and Jefferson so readers can make up their own mind. But if I had to pick a side, I would put myself in the middle and say I am a Madisonian.
Good move. Now, you've pointed out also several instances in the book and in their careers where both Hamilton and Jefferson veered away from their own principles and embraced the others, certainly when it was to their benefit. Can you give us, our audience, some examples of that too? And I want them to buy your book, so you don't have to tell us all of them, but there are some great examples.
Absolutely. Well, the best is one of the early ones. Jefferson is inaugurated in 1800. He defends limited government and balanced budgets and strict construction of the Constitution. But then he has an opportunity to double the size of the United States and buy Louisiana when Napoleon unexpectedly offers it. I renounce Louisiana, says Napoleon. Jefferson has just a moment to make a decision because he's afraid Napoleon may change his mind. There's just one problem. He thinks that buying Louisiana is unconstitutional because he wants to strictly construe the territories clause of the Constitution to refer only to the territories held by the U.S. at the time of ratification of the Constitution. Briefly, he toys with the idea of a constitutional amendment that would authorize the Louisiana Purchase, but then he thinks he might lose his window. So he says, never mind, and agrees to buy Louisiana, even though he thinks it's unconstitutional. This led Henry Adams, the historian, to sputter that Jefferson had taken a view of federal power broader than anything that Hamilton himself had ever embraced. So that's Jefferson's great switch. And Hamilton has many too. I mean, he's a great defender of Union. He's an opponent of Burr. But toward the end of his life, even Gouverneur Morris, his friend, suspects that he too may be thinking about leading a filibuster movement into Louisiana and supporting a kind of effort to seize the territory for the U.S., which is a version of what he accused Burr of doing. And that's why Gore Vidal, in his really amusing and wonderful novel, Burr, accuses Hamilton of doing exactly what he himself accused Burr of doing.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your effort to stay neutral in the book, and it's an admirable one. I think you've done an excellent job of doing so. But I found myself, as I read it, being surprised at my reaction that when they veered away from their own principles and embraced the others, that I didn't feel it was so much hypocritical, although there are elements of that, but rather it was also a reflection on the practicality of effective government or governing, or sort of at least in accomplishing their own goals once in office or with authority. And was that an intended, and maybe that was a product of you being neutral, because I don't think you were harshly critical of them when they veered away from their principles, embraced the others. But is that an intended consequence of, or an intention of your book?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
I would add, oh, good. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Please.
Well, and the other question, the follow-up on that I had was if they ever acknowledged that they were veering from their own and embracing the others' viewpoints.
On that point, I mean, when Jefferson is advising Washington not to sign the bank bill, he says, but if Washington disagrees, it would be fine to defer to Congress or to the broader views of public opinion. So he shows there a kind of humility. On Louisiana, I don't know if he ever acknowledged that he was totally flip-flopping and being hypocritical, although it certainly was a case where he viewed the pragmatic exigency as trumping ideological purity. But there were other occasions where the switches were purely partisan, like Hamilton, in one of his most shameful moments, tries to overturn the election of 1800, which had gone for Burr by changing the election rules. This is the gubernatorial election just before 1800. He wants to change the rules after the election's already taken place, which John Jay mercifully resists. They're a combination of they're statesmen, they're geniuses, they are philosophers, but they're also practical politicians who want to win. And and that's the great tension of American politics, that at all stages, the only thing that separates us from descending into violence is the tempering of power or partisanship with principle. And it's the principles of Hamilton and Jefferson that temper the partisanship, but often the principles are adjusted or abandoned for partisan purposes. Even at those times, though, it's the tension between the principles and the partisan political goals that sustains the experiment. And that's why I say Hamilton and Jefferson themselves may have betrayed their own principles, but they gave us the gift of principles to debate.
Yeah, well stated. Let's talk about their views on the courts and judicial interpretations, implied powers versus strict construction, and maybe give a few examples of those in your book.
Well, we've talked about the bank, and that's the biggest debate. Is there an implied power to charter the bank, as Hamilton says, or should the bank be struck down because there's no enumerated power? Many other examples. The Missouri Compromise is one. That's another debate over the territories clause. A big one is the constitutionality of Reconstruction, and the court in the civil rights cases in the 1880s strikes down the Civil Rights Act of 1875 on the grounds that the power to prohibit discrimination in places of public accommodations is not appropriate or indubitably necessary. It's a kind of strict construction of the necessary and proper clause again. Similar debate over the New Deal, the central opinions striking down the New Deal and then after the switch in time upholding it are all about whether the necessary and proper clause should be construed liberally or strictly. And we see many, many examples of it today as well. So that's my sense that those debates are the essential one in American constitutional history. It's not between other methodologies of interpretation like originalism versus non-originalism. It's within the debate about text and history. Should the text be construed liberally or strictly?
And you also give many examples in the book and throughout our history of Hamilton's and Jefferson's principles about power and its influence in the politics of the day, from Henry Clay to Webster, Calhoun, Garfield, John Marshall Harlan, Teddy Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, President Wilson and Coolidge, Did any surprise you in the course of your research?
Well, all of them, in the sense that I had no idea they were such deep students of history. The vision of James Garfield sitting up in the Ohio Law Library and reading the collected works of Hamilton and then making Hamilton the patron saint of Reconstruction was so surprising. It was so surprising that in the election of 1912, all three of the candidates are constitutional historians who admire Hamilton. I talked about Theodore Roosevelt embracing Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends. I didn't know that Roosevelt had written a biography of Gouverneur Morris and considered himself a Hamiltonian on national power. And then how surprising that Woodrow Wilson was an admirer of Hamilton and of his strong vision of presidential power, given the fact that he was a Southern Democrat who had grown up with Jefferson everywhere. And then William Howard Taft, one of my other heroes, is a great fan of Marshall and Hamilton and views them as the patron saints of judicial review. I could keep going, but I was very struck by what deep students of history our presidents and Supreme Court justices have been, and how deeply they read the primary works of Hamilton and Jefferson.
Well, you do an excellent job of it, and we're very grateful for those efforts, Jeff. Now, you've covered the pursuit of happiness and liberty. What's next? Life? What's next? What's on your horizon?
The third volume in what's going to be the Founders Trilogy is the pursuit of union. And in particular, I'm going to examine how the four most influential delegates at the Constitutional Convention defined union and defined America. And it took me a while to figure out who those four most influential delegates were, but then I just saw a list of who spoke most frequently at the convention. And listeners, I'm sure, will be able to recite this along with me, but top of the list is Gouverneur Morris, and then James Wilson, and then James Madison, and then Roger Sherman. And I'm going to say that those four, one, the well-known Madison, and then three forgotten founders, were central in their debates about union versus states' rights, in their debates about the meaning of freedom of conscience, and in their debates about the purpose of the Constitution. So I can't wait to tell those stories.
Well, we can't wait to read them. Keep writing, Jeff. It's fascinating history. You do a wonderful job of presenting it, and we're very, very grateful. I want to thank you so much for joining me today, Jeff. It's been engaging and informative as usual. But your book is also inspiring, I think, and it adds greatly to an understanding of our country, both its history and its future. And Jefferson often stated that the best way to preserve our liberties, which is in the title of your book, is to have an educated citizenry. And I think your book contributes mightily to that education. And I hope many people buy it and read it. And the copies of, I'm going to hold it up, The Pursuit of Liberty are available in our Supreme Court gift shop from the Supreme Court Historical Society and online at www.supremecourtgifts.org. And I encourage you all to read it. It's fascinating history and well written as usual. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you, James. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.